Well, we found out at the Game Awards in 2025 what Casey Hudson's next journey would be. It would be with Arcanaut Studios, making a Star Wars game. In fact, making the Fate of the Old Republic, which is connected to one of his previous projects when he was at BioWare. This was a surprising announcement, to say the least. We'll get into why. And I also want to talk about who is at the studio currently that we know of, and some kind of interesting connections between this project and this studio with Humanoid Origin, the defunct studio that never even announced a game that Casey was at previously and had founded, as well as BioWare. So let's take a look at all of that right now. Okay, so in December of 2025 at the Game Awards, Star Wars Fate of the Old Republic was announced as a game that I believe is literally probably not even in pre-production. It probably is now. I assume they have enough stuff going on now, and that this new studio, Arcanaut Studios, has likely, as far as I can tell, probably been in the works for at least around a year or so. But some interesting stuff here. So with Casey Hudson, formerly of BioWare, and actually Xbox Studios as well. I didn't know that in that window, when he left BioWare and went back to BioWare after a couple of years, I forgot that he was at Xbox Studios as like one of their creative directors or whatever. That obviously didn't work out. This was an interesting post and announcement because I believe from I think it was the end of 2024 when they announced the Humanoid Origin was shutting down to this, he had only posted one other time on social media, and it was N7 Day 2025, just doing kind of a generic, like, hey, happy N7 Day, blah, 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 right? Obviously a franchise, and even I'm sure BioWare to a point, a studio that still means something to him. It's the reason he's doing this, as well as the other things he's done. And that was after a big drought and a lot of quietness after Humanoid Origin got shut down. It is a studio that never announced a game. We saw some kind of random concept art that they had posted, but nothing ever came of it. And when the funding they had, which was kind of a post-COVID era situation where, pre-COVID or even during the beginning of that situation, funding was, if you had two legs and a pulse, heck, not even two legs, you get funding for a video game, right? And a lot of it was coming from China, and just a lot of investors that were, looking for money to burn because there were lots of things going on that allowed borrowing money to be really, really cheap. Well, years later now, the opposite is true. It's almost impossible to find money for investments and things like that. And that's dried up. We've seen a bunch of studios close. And we've seen, multiple former BioWare people affected by this. Casey Hudson had Humanoid Origin shut down. Mac Walters had his studio shut down as well. And if you remember back in the 2020, 2021 era, there were 3 or 4 dozen of these studios that popped up. Hey, we're a AAA studio led by, and it would be like 4 or 5 people from studios that you'd probably heard of them before. And the studios they were from were, BioWare, Activision, all these big, notable studios. And almost none of those studios ended up making games, and almost all of them shut down before they were able to do that because of the situation. So this was notable just because of that. Now, here just a couple of days ago, he posted this, Casey did, saying, Happy Star Wars Day. This was May the 4th. We invite you to meet a few of the people working on Fate of the Old Republic here at Arcanaut Studios. The team we're putting together is incredible. So let's take a look at that team. So here is their very fancy website, Arcanaut Studios. You scroll down, it's one of these websites where you can't click on anything. It's all this. So we have these 6 people here who are the only people we currently know are at Arcanaut. I assume that is going to expand pretty quickly, but let's talk about them first. So first we have Dan Fessenden. I found Dan to be a little hard to find info about. He doesn't have a LinkedIn page and things like that. But still, if you look at the Moby Games website here, you can see his record. A pretty natural fit, it seems like, for this studio and for this game specifically. Back in his first credit, it was as a programmer back on Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic. So go figure. And then Mass Effect, these are all while he was at BioWare. And it looks like all of his credits, as far as I can tell, were BioWare in some capacity. And that goes up through what you would expect. The Sonic RPG, if you don't remember that. The Mass Effect Galaxy, which I believe was the mobile game, but correct me in the comments if I'm wrong. Star Wars The Old Republic, the original Mass Effect, Dragon Age Inquisition, and DLC, Mass Effect Andromeda, Underworld Ascendant. Someone will have to tell me what that is. I have no idea. Same with Old Gods Rising. I'm assuming these were, oh, well, that's a special thing. So he probably just advised or something. And then Anthem in 2019. And then his last credit was on the Veilguard. So he was a level designer. So he was still at BioWare until extremely recently. So this is, unfortunately, probably one of those switches. I don't know when he left BioWare. Maybe it was before Arcanaut. But this may be a casualty for BioWare, which we're under the impression may be as small as like 50 devs right now, if that. So that would be an interesting thing to find out more about. If you know more, please let me know. The next one we have here is Melanie Faulkner. She is listed here as the Director of External Development. So here we have Melanie's page here on LinkedIn, and it is showing something that we'll probably see quite a bit of. We have the current Arcanaut position. Then we have a production director at Beamdog. This was a studio that a whole bunch of former BioWare people, mostly people who were laid off last year or in the year before, a lot of them went to this studio. Before that, she was at Humanoid Origin. So she was one of the people laid off and who lost their job at the end of 24 when that studio shuttered, and then had spent it seems like the majority of her previous career at BioWare. Her last project appears to be the Mass Effect Legendary Edition, but also worked on Anthem, Veilguard, Inquisition, and its DLCs, and back to then. It looks like she had another job there for a couple of years. So this is going to be a theme, I believe, and we're going to see multiple people may have this kind of track. Here we have Pascal Blanche is how I'm going to say it. I'm sure it's wrong. Currently listed as the studio art director of Arcanaut Studios. They talk about here 30 plus years in the game industry. Currently their current position. If we go down here, we see some posts from Casey. We see some when they announced the game itself. Here we have the studio art director of Arcanaut Studios. This is one of the unique ones. Not a former BioWare developer. Actually appears to have spent the longest amount of time at Ubisoft Montreal, working on Far Cry and other games there. It looks like their most recent thing was here with Behavior Interactive. I've heard of this studio, but I don't know too much about them. But just from what I've seen from their portfolio and stuff like that, this makes sense. They are obviously very skilled and very talented. And this is one of the ones that kind of bucks the trend a little bit with what we'll see from the others. Okay, and here we have the legend, Caroline Livingstone. This was a person who I really, really hoped would end up back at BioWare. But they did not, and that's a bummer. If you like the performances in any BioWare games, the voice performances and motion capture and all that, especially voice acting, you should love Caroline, because she is probably the reason you love it. She spent 14 years at BioWare, as you see here, as the person who is a director of voiceover and performance capture. So she was a big part of the reason that that old style of BioWare, games from the old Mass Effects to the Dragon Age games and all that, were so legendary. She's one of the best ever to do this, and she is one of the ones who went to Humanoid Origin in 2021. It was a pretty big loss. It was about a year after Casey had left and started his new studio. And here she doesn't even have that Humanoid was shut down. I don't know if she's been anywhere in between. Again, I was really hoping she would end up back at BioWare. Obviously that didn't happen. But this is an insanely good thing for for Arcanaut and for the Star Wars game. You can pretty much guarantee the cutscenes, the voice acting, the cinematics, and all that are going to be amazing. And she is a huge part of the reason why. Here we have Ryan Hoyle. I believe this is they're also listed as one of the founders of the studio. So they're the partner. So there's that, and chief technology officer at Arcanaut. If we scroll down here, we see yet another pretty common thing here. So we have from 1998 to 2000, 21 years at BioWare as a senior software engineer. Again, another one of these ones who left around the same time as Casey. Then went to Epic for a year, and then was at Humanoid Origin for 3.5 years almost, and then came over to Arcanaut. Again, like that's an insane amount of experience. You're talking about 25 plus years, getting up to 30 years of experience in the field. Obviously connected to people who are at Arcanaut, and it's kind of hard to argue that this person is valuable, and another one of the kind of traveling posse that Casey's been taking along with him since he left BioWare. And then here we have the man, the myth, the legend himself, Casey Hudson, CEO and director of Arcanaut Studios. As most people remember him as the BioWare legend. Spent, if I go before here, 10 plus years, I believe, at BioWare, doing all the things that he did, Mass Effect, Dragon Age, all that. And then he did spin from 15 to 17 as the creative director at Xbox Studios, which I forgot, even though as someone who's pretty connected to Xbox. And now this was before I started making content, making video game content. I was way less like informed about this stuff at that time. I wasn't paying attention to who the creative director at Xbox was back then, but still kind of interesting. His time back at BioWare for 4 years that ended in 2020, which is right before Humanoid Origin was founded, and then 3 years later we had Humanoid Origin shut down again without them even ever announcing a game, which is a bummer. And then he has on here from 2020 until now, video games and other serious fun. So that's I guess his little way of expressing where his mind is at with all this, I guess. And then the founder of Arcanaut Studios in July of 2025. Yeah. So that fits up with some other stuff we'll look at here in a moment. But the thing about Casey Hudson for me, I'm a newer BioWare / Mass Effect fan. And so he doesn't quite have that same like legend to me necessarily. Seems like a cool guy. I've watched all of his old interviews and stuff like that as I got into the Mass Effect fandom. But you have to understand, for me, kind of getting into the brand and the franchise in 2021, he's been gone. I remember him announcing he was leaving in 2020. I remember that being news, but I didn't really think much of it. I could have cared less. But now I'm really invested. And I have to acknowledge that, like, I guess he doesn't have that same legend to me. I look at him the way I look at a lot of the people who used to be at BioWare and worked on these old games I liked. That, I feel like whether, especially with art, there's a window, there's a moment where things can work. And, he couldn't do Mass Effect again because that, especially the trilogy, all 3 games so quickly, that was a unique time and a unique place. Like everything worked out perfectly, and it's not a perfect game or franchise. Like, let me be clear, but that generation of technology and the expectations from consumers at that time meant that you didn't have to, you could make a game in 2 years, right? That even if it meant cutting corners and things that we know now, right? That team they had at that time was the right team for those games at that time, in that moment, in that point in the industry. You could take all those developers that made the Mass Effect trilogy and put them all together again. The writers, the tech people, the animators, the design people, and Casey and everyone else that we remember, into a studio together again today and be like, okay, make 3 more Mass Effect games or a new franchise. Do that again. And they couldn't, because the industry has changed. Those people have changed. The technology has changed. The expectations have changed. The budgets have changed. things are just different now than they were. So, people being excited for this next game because of Casey in this situation, dope, cool. I get it. It's probably going to be awesome. I'm excited for it, even though I'm not really a fan of the previous games. I'm curious. This is obviously going to be a super high production game that's going to be an RPG, and it's going to be set in a franchise that I like, even if I'm not super invested in it. Great. But I will say that, I come from a perspective of that legend doesn't really exist for me, for as it may for people who have been BioWare, Mass Effect, whatever fans for 20 years almost at this point, right? So I don't know. I just feel like I have kind of a different perspective on it. It doesn't mean it's right or wrong. That's just kind of my spiel on it. But good for him getting to pursue his dream here. Obviously, the right pick to move this franchise forward. And then I want to wrap this up with kind of just an interesting thing I found here. So there's all these positions listed. So they have 7, 8, 9, 10, around 10 listings for jobs. These are jobs that if I look at this, I'm seeing pre-production here, that they're trying to get their team going to get the pre-production done. I assume they'll expand even more or work with a code developer when they actually get into production of this game. AKA, I don't think this game's coming for like 3-4 years at this point. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they're further along than I thought, but they only founded the studio less than a year ago, right? So this is going to be one of those things where they probably announced it way too soon, but that's the way it works. I get it, especially for recruiting. I'm sure that's a big part of it. One interesting thing I did find is that if you go into these listings, or if you search for where the Arcanaut Studio is, you get 2 results, which I found to be somewhat interesting. So if you go there, you open this up, and this is where the job listings are posted. So they are specifically for this 10324 address. So my assumption is that they have like an HR office, and that's what this is, because the jobs are listed as like hybrid remote jobs. Because if you search on Google for just Arcanaut Studio's location, you get this building in Edmonton, Canada, this big giant office building. That this is more what you would expect for a game studio. For one of these, probably one of the floors or half a floor is their studio, where they're going to have room to put all the people in. The last bit, and this is just purely I think just kind of interesting or funny, is to see this. And if you see here, these 2 points, these are 16 or 1,800 feet away from each other, a little over 500 meters. And that is the distance between the BioWare studio and this new Arcanaut studio. So something tells me that's not all that crazy. I would be willing to bet if you looked up, what is in this area, it's probably a bunch of game studios. And if you look, it's kind of like an office park, basically. But I do think it's at least interesting that these folks are going to see each other at lunch. So what to take away from all this? This game's going to be in good hands. Fate of the Old Republic is going to be in good hands with a bunch of really experienced people who have experience with the franchise in the past, who have experience and time with some of the most legendary and loved RPGs ever, led by a guy who, at least on reputation and in practice a long time ago at this point, has been able to fulfill, the kind of desires of people wanting to get into these deep worlds with deep relationships and choices and actions and all that. So I'm going to be looking out for this. I'm really curious to see how this happens. I think we're many years away from this even releasing. Let's do the fun game of what comes first, Mass Effect 5 or Fate of the Old Republic, because one's probably going to have a bigger team and more money behind it in Fate of the Old Republic. The other, in Mass Effect 5, you would assume has a 2 or 3 year head start at least on pre-production and all that, but maybe dealing with a smaller budget and a smaller team. So we'll make that a friendly wager. If you want more videos like this one, follow-ups on former BioWare folks, news about Mass Effect 5, news about just gaming in general, hit the subscribe button. Hit the little thumbs up so more people see the video. Leave a comment with what you're thinking, or to just say hello. That's great too. Consider becoming a member if you want videos like this one just a bit early, as well as some other perks. Check out the links in the video description for ways to get merch, ways to check out my other content, other ways to support, and so on. That is all I have for this one. So until next time.